Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Bloomsbury SET Conference, Session 3, Funding Interdisciplinary Global Health Research. We're delighted to have three fantastic speakers from UKRI, Innovate UK, and Nesta. I am Aygen Kurt-Dixon, Research and Innovation Strategy Manager from the LSE, and I'm also a steering group member of the Bloomsbury SET. This session, as the others, is being recorded and it will be available on the Bloomsbury SET website. Please do sign up for the upcoming sessions. We have fantastic speakers again, very much delighted to host them tomorrow and also Friday. So today we'll have three presentations. Each presenter will speak 10 minutes. And after the three speakers complete their presentations, we're going to move to audience question and answers. Please send your questions during the presentations, add them onto the portal that you're sent the link to, and as we progress throughout the session. So our first speaker is Professor Helen Lambert, who is the Professor of Medical Anthropology and Challenge Leader for Global Health at UKRI. And she's also from Bristol Medical School. Helen, it's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to be here. As Aygen has mentioned, I'm both a Professor of Medical Anthropology and I happen to have quite a large portfolio of cross-disciplinary AMR research across the world. But I'm primarily today going to be speaking in my capacity as challenge leader for global health. Next slide, please. So just to clarify, UKRI was formed in 2017 to align and bring together all of the UK research councils. And I think that's an especially relevant point for addressing the more complex global challenges, which often cross different council remits. My own role sits within the international development team at the overarching body of UK research and innovation, spanning the research councils. And I'm particularly concerned with the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is a very large multi-billion pound fund for addressing a range of global challenges. Next slide, please. So this was just my attempt to illustrate that in terms particularly of funding infectious disease and AMR, but more generally global health, we're looking at a very complex funding landscape. And I've just tried to list a few of the principal sources here, which have a record of funding research in infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance. I managed to omit from the list the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, which historically has only funded UK-focused work, but in the last few years has started also to fund global health, and I sit on their global health panel. In the rest of the talk, I think it's worth also highlighting here, of course, the Wellcome Trust, which has a long history of funding research in AMR, and actually very recently, I think in December, published their new funding strategy for AMR, and infectious disease is another of their priority theme areas. Having said that, in the rest of the talk, I'll only be addressing UKRI in terms of it as a funder, and specifically their portfolio of research that's principally directed at funding work that occurs in low and middle income countries. So is funded through the strand, which is eligible for overseas development assistance, or ODA funding sources. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some indicative data from an analysis of the UKRI Global Health Portfolio. And this is partly in an attempt to try to address the theme of cross-disciplinarity, which it's not possible to look at directly within funded awards, but we can use various proxies to look at that. So this first one simply is a breakdown of our global health ODA portfolio by sustainable development goal. And as you can see, a large proportion of the overall pot of funded awards is for global health, but it also intersects with quite a large number of the other sustainable development goals that of course are highly relevant to and intersect with health priorities. Next slide, please. So this is to show more specifically the breakdown of funding across AMR and infectious disease, knowing this is a particular field of interest for Bloomsbury set people. So awards specifically funded in the last 5 years in this domain totaled, as you can see, over 8,500 grants at just under £6 billion. So it is a very substantial funding priority for UKRI. And of those, in terms of what we're able to do by way of analysis, as you can see, we had over 3,200 grants coded as infectious disease and 112 grants coded as AMR. Now, to me and to the challenge manager, Charlie Allen, who I thank for putting together, for doing the analysis of the portfolio for me, this total of just under 50 million looks a bit small, and I think it probably is. The reason for this is that the way data are coded means that when there are cross-cutting calls, for example, we often team up with other funders. So, for example, with NIHR or Department of Health to fund projects. If the principal funder was a different funder, it would be coded within our portfolio as 0, even though actually there's a substantial contribution from UKRI. So I think probably quite a bit more funding is going into AMR than it looks from that slide. It has been a major focus and was the first thematic area to be funded by all 7 research councils at UKRI as a priority area in recognition of the cross-disciplinary nature of antimicrobial resistance as a major challenge. Next slide, please. If we just look specifically at the infectious disease fundings at the beneficiary countries, you can see there's a really wide spread across a range of lower and middle income countries which have been funded by various awards. You can also see that there's a particularly large focus in the portfolio on the larger focal countries of India, South Africa, then Nigeria, and of the trio of East African countries where a lot of this research takes place. But there is smaller representation across a multitude of global foci. Next slide, please. Another way to attempt to look across disciplines within the UKRI funding for global health is to look at which was the principal research council. And you can see from here that, not surprisingly, the MRC is the largest single funder in this area, but we also have, you can see on just to the left of it, funding from Innovate UK, which we have Joe speaking in this panel, and quite a bit of funding also from the BBSRC, which funds biological and sciences and work within, for example, the biotechnologies and the experimental science side of things, as well as some funding at the extreme left from AHRC, which is arts and humanities. So it's a sort of proxy for trying to look a little bit at disciplinary leads. But as I said, many of the ones that sit ostensibly within one council here will actually have an array of investigators from different disciplines. Next slide, please. So moving on to one particular funding source that I just wanted to highlight to the audience today because it's quite new, is a new board which has been established by the Medical Research Council with a specific remit to address an area that they have seen as a gap in previous funding, which is to look at applied global health research. And as it says on the slide here, there is an intention to fund the whole spectrum of research under this board. It doesn't exclude fundamental science, but going right the way through to applied health systems and in implementation research. And there is a particular desire to increase investment in global health research and in global health capacity building. And so it's a really great sign that the MRC have decided to set up this dedicated board and to diversify and integrate the health topics that they have until now been able to fund under different, rather more specific areas like neuroscience or population health. And in particular, that one of the priorities is indeed to form new multidisciplinary and cross-sector links. And I've just put up the web link there to more details about that board. It met last year for the first time, and we've just had our second funding panel, which is the first to award any full applications under that remit. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight some of the issues around the funding principles that underlie funding in global health, because I think they're important when we think about interdisciplinarity and cross-country research, particularly sitting in the UK, in a high-income country. And the Applied Global Health Board, I've put a quote from them on here, which is very much aligned to other funders in this space. And there's a link there as well in the quote to the UK Collaborative on Development Research's report on building partnership of equals, highlighting that the way in which decision-making processes should be open and two-way and decisions based on fairness. And equitable partnerships is something that we have highlighted as a founding principle within the Global Challenges Research Fund as something that is crucially important. And we recognise in relation to that, that when funding global health across different country partnerships, of course, not everyone will necessarily have the same resources or the same strengths. And this is why the second principle I've mentioned on this slide is capacity strengthening, which is included in the remit of the Applied Global Health Board and other funders, because we recognise the need in equal partnership to build ways of being able to exchange knowledge, conduct research and innovate between high and low and middle income country partners. And that's something that will be looked at if you would put in an application to any of these funders. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, well, my final but one, and it's just some tips for success that I have come up with from my own experience, both as a researcher in this field and as someone who's sat on quite a lot of panels and has worked in particular across, as an anthropologist by background, with people from a huge array of other disciplines. The first is to challenge your own implicit assumptions, because I think when we work with colleagues from our own disciplines, it's very easy to assume we're all on the same page. And that's not something we can assume when we're working with people from other disciplines. Linked with that, language is really important. Even if we're using the same terms, if we have different disciplinary backgrounds, we may mean something slightly different. But that's certainly the case when it comes to even things like what you might think is straightforward, like a term like sampling. And review boards in global health are very often, if not always, cross-disciplinary. So you need to clarify and translate your terms and concepts and not assume that everyone is who is going to be reading your proposal is also a biomechanical engineer or a physiologist or a microbiologist. A small tip from somebody who comes from a social science background is just to say that social sciences too have historically often been used as sort of handmaidens to other more hard science methodologies, but they do constitute more than qualitative methods. They have their own theories and concepts, and they also don't simply do participant engagement. And finally, think about your stakeholders. As we continue to fund more work that is globally focused and increasingly challenge-led, thinking about who is actually going to be the recipient of your research findings and their relevance to those stakeholders, and bringing them in at a really early stage in building your research design and setting up what you're actually going to do with your results at the end of the day, and how you're going to make sure their value is maximized, I think is really important. Next slide, please. So just to say thank you very much. I hope that's been helpful, and happy to join the panel for questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Helen. It was really interesting insights, and also your personal experience in grant assessment panels was very useful to hear, and the tips you came up with. It was very good. Thank you. Now I will move to Joe Frost from Innovate UK. Joe is the UK's national contact point and the global innovation lead for health and medicine at Innovate UK. So Joe, over to you.
Thank you. So firstly, I just wanted to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak today. And I've been asked to talk about funding interdisciplinary global health research and priorities. Actually, information on the UK funding has been slightly delayed at the moment because of the COVID pandemic. As you might know, there's a process where the UK government allocates spending called the Spending Review. And because of the pandemic, the recent spending review the government did allocated only 1 year of funding going forward to some areas, including to Innovate UK. So I thought I'd focus in this presentation a lot about the funding opportunities available from the EU, which has just launched a big new 7-year research programme. So I've also prepared this presentation alongside my colleague Phil Packer, who's the innovation lead for AMR and vaccines within Innovate UK. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell on this one too much because Helen's already talked a little bit about UKRI, but UKRI is made up of 9 organisations, one of which is Innovate UK, another one is the Medical Research Council. And together UKRI works to invest over 7 billion of government funding a year in research and innovation, and we aim to create knowledge with impact. Next slide, please. So Innovate UK within UKRI aims to drive productivity, economic growth, and support businesses to develop and realise the potential of new ideas. We aim to connect businesses, customers, and investors to turn ideas into commercially successful products, services, and business growth. Next slide, please. At the moment, within Innovate UK, we have 2 funding schemes that can fund health-related research and development. The first is the Biomedical Catalyst. This is currently on hold, but fingers crossed that this will continue soon. It funds projects at 4 different stages of development: feasibility, primer, early stage, and late stage. And for each level, each stage has a different level of funding. There's also an Innovate funding scheme called SMART, which funds up to 2 million across different phases, up to early clinical development. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, I'm mostly going to concentrate on European funding rather than UKRI Innovate UK funding. So the EU has a new research programme called Horizon Europe, which runs from 2021 to 2027, and there's 95.5 billion euros of funding available overall for Horizon Europe. I'm going to first talk about the pillar on the left, pillar 1. Within that, there's the European Research Council and Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions. These are both open to absolutely any research area, so you can decide what topic you want to apply for if you apply there. So firstly, the European Research Council funds large cutting-edge research grants for a principal investigator, a PI, and their team in any area of research. They have three main grant schemes. The first one is starting grants for PIs who are between 2 to 7 years after their PhD, and you can get up to 1.5 to 2.5 million euros over 5 years. There's certain cases like maternity or paternity leave where you can extend those eligibility windows. As well as the starting grants, the European Research Council also has consolidated grants, which are for PIs 7 to 12 years after their PhD, and you can get up to 2 to 3 million euros over 5 years. And they have an advanced grant scheme, which is for active researchers who have a significant track record over the last 10 years. And advanced grants give 2.5 to 3.5 million euros funding over 5 years. So that was the European Research Council in Pillar 1. Just to talk briefly about the Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions, also in Pillar 1 on the left. So these are open to all research areas, and it's about career development, training of researchers, and there's a focus on international, intersectoral collaboration and also people moving between countries. There's 4 main schemes within the Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions. Firstly, there's a staff exchange scheme, which promotes intersectorial, international, interdisciplinary collaboration in research and innovation through exchanging staff and knowledge at different stages of the innovation chain. And it's open to research, technical, administrative, and managerial staff, the staff exchange scheme. The second scheme I want to talk about within the Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions is the individual fellowships. These are aimed at people who hold a PhD and wish to acquire new skills, for example, advanced training or experience international or interdisciplinary or intersectoral mobility. The scheme also encourages researchers to work in non-academic sectors as well. So you can apply for individual fellowships in an area of your choice through the Marie Curie scheme. The Marie Curie scheme also has doctoral networks, which train people at doctoral level, and it has a part called co-fund, which co-funds national or international or regional fellowship or doctoral programs. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the health funding within Pillar 2 in the middle of the slide. That's the other main place to look for funding for people on this call, I think. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about EU exit and UK eligibility. So next slide, please. Okay, the UK is going to become what's known as an associated country in Horizon Europe. That means, as you can see in the nice green letters in the middle of the slide, that UK scientists, researchers and businesses will be able to access funding under Horizon Europe in exactly the same way as you would if you were in an EU country. So if you remember one thing from my presentation, I'd like it to be that bit in green in the slide. We have access to this 95.5 billion euros of funding over the next 7 years. And also just to say, this associated country concept is not a new thing. There were 16 associated countries in the previous EU research programme, including countries like Israel, Norway and Switzerland. So we'll make the slides available afterwards. So if you want to find out more, you can follow the links at the bottom of the slide as well. Next slide, please. So what does association mean? Well, there's lots of positive points at the top of the slide with the ticks. I'd like to highlight a few in particular. The bottom 3. So UK organisations can lead and influence collaborative projects and consortiums. UK peer reviewers can take part in the evaluations, and also UK government and research council representatives can take part in the programme committees, which are the committees which help design what the core topics are. And Innovate UK are involved in the programme committee for health. At the bottom, there's a couple of small caveats. UK will not participate in one small bit of funding, which is the European Innovation Council Equity Fund, but UK can still access other bits of the European Innovation Council, but that's only one tiny bit. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be interesting to explain how much money the UK health researchers have got from European funding in the past. In the last 7-year programme called Horizon 2020, there was 5.45 billion euros awarded overall, and 791 million, which was 15% of the overall money, went to the UK, and that included 113 million to companies. And there was about 1,500 UK participations overall. At the bottom of the slide, there's a heat map which shows where the EU funded across the world for the previous programme, which is quite interesting. On the right hand side of the slide, you can see that in the health cluster in particular, there's 8.3 billion euros of funding available over the next 7 years. And we'd like to help UK organisations get as much of that as possible. If we can get the same fraction as before, then the UK would get 1.2 billion euros over the next 7 years. And about 170 million euros of that would go to companies in the UK as well. So at the bottom, I just wanted to highlight that the EU funding doesn't just fund the EU countries, it also funds the US, that's in the health cluster, but not in the other areas. It funds the associated countries like the UK will be, and it funds many low and middle income countries around the world as well. So you really can collaborate in a global way. As well as the main health programme, there's also funding through a cancer mission, and there's various other things called partnerships, of which one is the Innovative Health Initiative, which has a lot of funding. Next slide, please. So on this slide, there's the main 6 sub-areas within the health cluster of Horizon Europe. And I wanted to bring to particular attention the third one down, which is tackling diseases and reducing disease burden, which includes better diagnostics, infectious disease threats as well. So next slide, please. So this shows some examples of what we understand the calls are likely to contain. The calls haven't officially been published yet. They're expected to be published in April, but we think that it will include these call topics on the slide. We've highlighted some where AMR is particularly relevant, but there's lots of other call topics too. If you're interested in knowing more about potential call topics or where you might fit in, then please contact me directly afterwards, and my details are available on the last slide. But this just gives you a flavour of some of the things that will be done. Next slide, please. So related to EU funding, there's also something called the Joint Programming Initiative on AMR, or JPI AMR. This is a global collaboration platform involving 28 different member countries, including the UK, and the aim is to curb AMR with a One Health approach. The initiative coordinates national funding to support transnational research activities within 6 areas in general, which are outlined in the JPI AMR Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda. Overall, the 6 priorities are therapeutics, diagnostics, surveillance, transmission, environment, and interventions. So the JMR has run various calls. It's actually got one open at the moment. So that's on the bottom half of the slide. The call is on One Health interventions to prevent and reduce the development and transmission of AMR. The pre-proposals need to be submitted by the 16th of March. If you're interested in that, there's also a whole presentation online with information about this on their website. Next slide, please. So the current call advocates a One Health approach, and proposals should focus on at least 2 One Health settings. So that's human, animal, and environment. And they should either aim to do one of the 2 bullet points on the slides. So understand the impact of interventions on the development and transmission of antibiotic resistance in or between at least 2 One Health settings. Or you could look at the second bullet point, design, implement, evaluate, and compare innovative interventions to control the development and transmission of antibiotic resistance in or between at least 2 One Health settings. Also, it's an opportunity to work with low and middle income countries, LMICs, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So I won't go over this slide in detail, but this specifies some areas which are excluded from the current call. So if you are interested in that, then have a careful look at this and the call documentation after the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'd like to finish there until we have the panel discussion, but my contact details are there. And also, if you're interested in the UK funding from Innovate UK, you can contact Phil Packer. I'm probably the best contact for the EU funding side of things, but you've got both of our details there. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. It was very useful, and it's very good to have a peek into the upcoming potential call titles from the Horizon Europe program under the health cluster. And it's also good news that we have access to that funding. And I'm particularly happy to hear we will have access to European Innovation Council funding as well. So thank you so much for that insight. Now I will be moving to our next speaker, Ruth Neal from Nesta, who is the program manager for global health and the Longitude Prize. And Ruth will tell us more about it. And in the meanwhile, I'd like to remind our participants, please post your questions on the shared space. We will be coming back to your questions at the end of all the presentations. Ruth, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to everyone at the Bloomsbury Set team for inviting me to speak today on the Longitude Prize. I'll briefly introduce you to our work at Nesta Challenges and then speak to the Longitude Prize that was established to spur the development of new diagnostic tests. And so I've worked in the area of antimicrobial resistance for 8 years, from searching for novel antibiotics in an academic setting through to supporting AMR diagnostic development with innovators across the world and engaging in communication and policy campaigns for AMR issues. Next slide, please. And at Nesta Challenges, we run challenge prizes across the globe. So challenge prizes are innovation competitions designed to award the best or first solution to defined problem. Challenge prizes can be used to tackle a diverse set of problems, from developing alternatives to the wheelchair, to finding digital solutions which improve career information, advice and guidance, and then exploring how drone technology can be used to benefit cities. We work with a variety of different partners and funders, including government departments, regulators, and foundations. Next slide, please. Within our growing global health portfolio at Nesta Challenges, we have the Longitude Prize to create a transformative diagnostic solution to tackle antimicrobial resistance. In 2020, we launched the Global Surgical Training Challenge to find solutions to support training surgeons in low and middle income countries. And we're supported by the Intuitive Foundation and MIT in the US to do this work. And we also have 2 prizes in development, one to address dementia and another one on chronic persistent pain. Next slide, please. So challenge prizes offer a series of incentives with a final prize to whoever can first or most effectively meet a defined challenge. In their simplest form, challenge prizes are a mechanism for rewarding people who solve problems. They are problem specific, outcomes focused and open. And they aim to tap into and engage the broadest possible communities of innovators. Next slide, please. So the theory of change that our challenge prizes are structured around aims to create 3 impacts around innovations, innovators, and the broader ecosystem. It's also against these 3 impacts that we measure our impact. So breakthrough innovations, this is the part about developing tangible solutions to the problem the challenge set out to solve. So challenge prizes can directly stimulate innovation towards a specific desired outcome, direct attention to an undeserved market, and even stimulate a new market. They can accelerate the development and adoption of new products. So unlock systemic change. This is the broader impact that the challenge can have outside the immediate problem or the immediate innovators working on it. Challenge prizes can shape the future direction of markets and technology, develop regulatory and policy insights. For example, deep understanding of barriers to innovation, understanding emerging trends, and can develop partnerships in communities. And finally, helping innovators thrive. This is about helping the cohort of innovators, 1, solve the particular problem in the particular challenge they're working on, and 2, build up their skills for future projects. So challenge prizes provide tailored financial and non-financial support, raise innovator awareness of regulatory or policy issues, they build their profile, help them raise investment, and provide peer learning opportunities. And next slide, please. There are 4 common misconceptions about challenge prizes. First of all, they are not all the same. Challenge prizes are different from recognition prizes like the Nobel Prize, which reward people for past success. They differ from grant processes because they are a financial incentive that is paid out based on results, rather than an agreed schedule of payments. And they also differ from accelerators in that they are focused on a specific challenge and incorporate a reward. Secondly, challenge prizes can also incentivize and support the development of new service-driven solutions as well as tech. Thirdly, it's not all about the winner. We support the development of a cohort of innovators while strengthening and testing a pipeline of solutions. And the fourth misconception is the prizes are simple. Just announce one final prize and let the winners come to you. Before launching, a carefully considered research and design process is essential to ensure the prize will be effective. And then after launch, we invest in comms and a range of financial and tailored non-financial incentive support activity to attract and support the innovators that are competing. Next slide, please. Here's just a snapshot of comparing innovation methods from our practice guide, which I have touched on the previous slide, and I will make these slides available to you after this talk. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the first Longitude Prize took place in the 18th century. The UK government wanted to open up innovation and award an innovator to solve calculating longitude at sea. At this time, this could not be solved by the top astronomers and scientists. The £20,000 prize was open to all and was eventually awarded after 20 years for the invention of the marine chronometer, a watch that can be used at sea. Fast forward 300 years, and the UK government again wanted to run another Longitude Prize that would address a new challenge of our time. 6 potential ideas were highlighted by the BBC Horizon and put out to the British public to vote on. And in 2014, the public voted that the prize should be focused on antibiotic resistance. Next slide, please. The AMR Longitude Prize has been running for 7 years. We want to award a competitor £8 million to develop a transformative, rapid, accurate, and affordable point of care diagnostic test that can significantly reduce antibiotic misuse or overuse anywhere in the world. We currently have 54 teams competing across 12 countries, and the competition is first past the post. We have a number of different types of tests competing in the prize, and the final deadline to apply to win is September 2022. Next slide, please. There are a number of ways we help the innovative companies competing in the Longitude Prize progress. Earlier in the programme, we provided seed funding of up to £25,000 through 29 Discovery Awards, and then we awarded a further 3 boost grants of up to £100,000. Our non-financial support focuses on boosting commercial and technical skills to help developers bring their product to market. Areas of support and guidance include investment strategy, regulation pathways, market access and adoption, and understanding clinical context and pathway. This support is delivered by events across the world normally, and more recently through virtual meetings and mentor sessions with consultants. We provide a platform to connect innovators, build new partnerships and collaborations, and provide peer learning opportunities. We also build their profile through media activities and comms, which can help the companies raise investment. Next slide, please. We engage in a number of activities and communication campaigns that impact the AMR ecosystem. We run communication campaigns on the AMR threat on cancer care in the UK, which has led to more AMR cancer international webinars and activities. We've published a report on AMR voices, including patients and clinicians working in the front line. COVID has held up AMR diagnostic development in the last year. The situation is improving, but we support and educate test developers to overcome challenges, such as validation studies on hold, new regulatory rules now that we've had Brexit. We connect stakeholders and clinicians to test and development in the programme to make sure that these tests, if they are developed and brought onto the market, are not just left on the shelf. Most recently, we are working with colleagues at NICE and NHS England to speed up the adoption of AMR diagnostics in the NHS. And our ultimate aim is to progress a suite of new diagnostics through the development pipeline to reach markets across the world to reduce antimicrobial resistance. Next slide. So finally, these are some platforms if you'd like to keep in touch. And yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to joining the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen, Joe, Ruth, for this insightful thoughts and information. It was very useful. I'd like to now open the floor for question and answers. But before that, I would like to ask to all panelists a question. I have some issues with the concept of interdisciplinarity as a research and innovation professional working in a research organization. So to the best of my understanding, it's a concept framed by academics, it's conceptualized by funders, and then it is also interpreted by evaluators. So I see a complex picture when I try to advise academics about how to approach interdisciplinarity when they are applying for funding. So from your point of view, what kinds of funding models would actually encourage interdisciplinary driven scientific advancement? And in your view, how could people like me, research, innovation, or knowledge exchange brokers contextualize this complexity? How could we navigate through this different, let's say, angles that are approaching this concept of interdisciplinarity? May I start with maybe Helen, if you would like to go first?
Straight to the heart of the problem, I think. I think you're right that interdisciplinarity is a complex and difficult concept, and I have tried previously to map out and try to conceptualize those distinctions between interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, all of which I think are closely related, and a lot of academics have spent a great deal of time and paper trying to kind of tease out distinctions between those aspects, which I don't think is necessarily very helpful. I think very often when people talk about interdisciplinarity, they're actually talking about cross-disciplinary research, which is not quite the same thing. On the other hand, what I think is really important, and the way it should be approached pragmatically in terms of thinking of funding and priorities, is through the fact that it has gained priority because there is a recognition appropriately that many of these complex problems that we're dealing with in areas like global health actually require more than one discipline to adequately address. And even the most brilliant technological innovation or new bench science discovery is not in itself going to solve, prevent infectious disease or deal with COVID without having a whole range of other considerations taken on board. And I know, for example, that applies to, without wanting to speak for Ruth, that applies to the Longitude Prize, which has parameters requiring that any test that meets the criteria is going to be available and acceptable to people. Well, no engineer is going to be able to look at that very effectively. You need people with social science expertise and familiarity with methods to do those kind of things. So I just kind of wanted to say that first. In terms of the funding models, I suppose I'm biased, but I mean, I think that the shift towards, I think the sorts of funding models that try to deal with these more challenge-led approaches are appropriate in terms of galvanizing researchers from different disciplines to work together in developing research designs and thinking through how they can work collaboratively across disciplinary fields to address these questions. So I think that the sort of model, which I hope is not going to go away, given the squeeze that the pandemic has put on everything, is a continuing focus on more thematic and challenge-led research approaches. And I think within that, there are a number of models which are already have been tried out, including, for example, pump priming or stage gating, whereby a group of researchers or a consortium gets given an initial funding pot to actually try to develop those networks and ways of working together before they actually start doing empirical data collection and so forth, in recognition of the fact that it is, this is not an easy thing to do. Interdisciplinary working is not something that we can all just walk into and do just like that. So those sort of staged calls or initial periods of funding which are given to offer that opportunity, I think are probably helpful. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Is there anything else that Ruth or Joe would like to contribute to this question?
I'm happy to speak a little bit about this if you like. So I agree that the challenge of how to best fund interdisciplinary research is one that many researchers and many research funders have struggled with in terms of the best way to approach this. The EU has both top-down and bottom-up calls. So in some areas, it's totally up to the researchers to decide what they want their research to cover, so they can organise themselves into interdisciplinary research groups if they want. And then the EU also does quite a lot of analysis to see what emerging areas there are from the bottom-up calls. This is of interest maybe for some of the more directed calls later. And when the EU does specify call topics, for example, in the health cluster, they will also often specify the need to have people from different disciplines and also different sectors, for example, citizens, patients, and also people from industry involved in the different consortiums applying. So one example of where it's been important to have an interdisciplinary approach was on Ebola, where the burial processes were an important part of the spread of disease. So it's important to have social scientists and humanities involved in some of the projects. And as Helen mentioned, research is also needed on the acceptance of new products and technologies as well, and economics often. I'd agree with one of the tips that Helen mentioned in her presentation earlier as well, that language is really important. The people within your different interdisciplinary group come from different backgrounds and have different, associate different meanings to some common words. And also your peer reviewers will be from different sectors as well. So writing a research proposal that's going to get a good mark from someone not in your discipline is a real important skill, and making sure you don't just assume everyone will be really familiar with the details of what you're doing when you write a proposal. So actually the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council, ESRC, ran an event looking at interdisciplinary research funded by the EU a couple of months ago. And this included some really useful case studies from people who've done very interdisciplinary projects in the past funded by the EU. So that's well worth watching for some tips and practical advice on how you can make this work in practice. So I'm happy to find out and share the link for that afterwards if anyone's interested. That's it from me, I think.
Thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think with, so from the Longitude Prize point of view and our teams that are advancing, it's all dependent on having a very interdisciplinary team that Helen has already touched on. They need to be speaking to clinicians, they need to be speaking to health economists, epidemiologists. This is all part of this ecosystem that needs to be supported by these diagnostic tests. So it's not just about the scientists and the engineers that are producing it. And I think from challenge prizes and Nesta Challenger's point of view, we hope that it is a new idea that some organisations are not aware of. But for example, the organisation we're working with to look at managing pain without pharmaceutical drugs. So one of our new global health team prizes in development, they want to encourage researchers to work in this space and new researchers. Previously, they have been a grant-giving organisation and lots of academics have been dependent on them. However, they've not seen innovation progress in this area. So want to tackle this gap and run a challenge prize to open it up to even more diverse innovators.
Thank you. I'm looking at the questions coming in the portal. What you also touched upon in relation to other disciplines and social sciences. There's a question here about the graph Helen used in the UKRI funding for global health, that, as Helen mentioned, the majority of the funding for global health comes from MRC and BBSRC and Innovate UK. How can we bring more researchers from humanities, social sciences and environmental sciences into solving global health challenges? So you all touched upon a bit on that, but what can these disciplines do to be more proactive, you think? And are there any other tips you could suggest? Who would like to go first?
Someone else want to go first this time?
I guess I would just have one small point. Just on the graph, I think some of the projects funded by a lead council probably have some interdisciplinary aspects from some other researchers. So that just looking at the title of the research council doesn't necessarily show the breadth of the projects. But maybe I'll pass over to Helen to talk more about the global health.
No, that's completely true. I was feeling rather embarrassed about having put up that breakdown, because although I mentioned it, I think it actually gives a slightly misleading picture. So I know, for example, that conversely, that within the cross-council theme 4, which was more on sort of the behavioural, social, antibiotic use side of things, after 3 initial previous calls which focus more on experimental microbiological aspects. The theme 4 included funded awards from which were led by at least one clinician and one epidemiologist, and that call was led by ESRC. So, you know, that what was ostensibly sitting under the Economic and Social Research Council was both highly cross-disciplinary and included, and was led by a clinician, but included health economists, social scientists, pharmacists, and the same is true conversely for funds under MRC. So I wouldn't take that too much as, you know, meaning that there's no funding for infectious disease by AHRC or ESRC, because it may be to do with the relative proportion within a grant. So that may not be an accurate reflection. Having said that, I think it's true to say, and in fact, there was an event immediately preceding this today on antibiotic use, certainly within the area of AMR, and I think probably infectious disease more broadly, although it is still a small minority of research which is led by social sciences and humanities. I think that is increasing quite rapidly. And we do see, even if you look at outputs, for example, there have been a couple of systematic reviews. One came out last year, which showed that in the AMR field, a small proportion of the outputs were social science, primarily social science, but there was a very steady and significant increase over the past 5 years up to 2020. And a lot of us who've been working for longer in this area from social sciences and humanities have been involved in a number of initiatives which have tried quite extensively to encourage greater involvement of the humanities and social sciences. I think to some extent, it comes back to a similar issue to do with sort of language and translation. I think there's a huge amount of relevance of work that people already do, whether it's across geography or economics or whatever, which has value for global health issues. But if you don't have a health background, the tendency is to assume that what you're doing is not relevant and to kind of stay away from it. So I think we actually need some sort of reverse initiative also going on within those disciplinary areas to say, look, actually, you know, you are welcome and we need you, rather than the impetus having to go in the other direction. I hope that helps answer the question. Yeah,
thank you. Jo, please.
Yes, I also thought I should probably mention, related to the Joint Programming Initiative on AMR that I mentioned earlier, the UK money going into that call comes from 3 different research councils: the Medical Research Council, the Biotechnology and Biology Research Council, and the Environment Research Council. So there's very much a move for the One Health approach there. And the Joint Programme Initiative on AMR is looking at increasing kind of industrial involvement, if they can, in future years as well. So I thought that might be useful to add.
Very useful, thank you. Going back to the questions, there's a question specifically for the Nestor Longitude Prize for Ruth. The boosting technical skills support you mentioned, is that something university researchers can participate in, or is it just for companies? You're muted, Ruth.
So yeah, we do a range of activities that we make available to anyone working in the AMR space, because we often overlap with diagnostics and antibiotic development. And often the webinars and educational activities that we have done, we have recorded and developed them into resources. So longitudeprize.org houses all of these resources, and it is open. We do different types of activities that are sometimes just focused on the teams competing in the Longitude Prize, but the majority is open to everyone.
Thank you. There's a question here for Helen from Ray Kent, who is the leader of the Bloomsbury set. How do you see the UK's decision to cut the ODA budget playing out in funding terms over the next couple of years? For example, will this have a negative impact of the funds available through the MRC's Applied Global Health Research Board?
So as Jo mentioned, we are currently awaiting a settlement from the spending review. And although, so that is being negotiated right now. So I'm really not able to comment on how things look, you know, how things are specifically going to look until those decisions are finalized. What I suppose I would say is that, of course, as we're all aware, and it's public knowledge that there has been a decision due to the pandemic to reduce our current ODA budget from 0.7 to 0.5 and of GDP, and together with the general recessionary impact of the pandemic, it means there will be a smaller overall ODA pot. So it makes sense that things are going to be tighter than they have been until now. I guess I would also point out, though, that the spending review is going to be only for, as Jo also mentioned, it's going to be a 1-year interim settlement. So whatever is the outcome from this current, for this immediate next year, will not necessarily determine then what happens after that. And I think we shouldn't be, we should try to remain optimistic about the mid to longer term recognition of the importance, with global Britain, of the value of this sort of global health, addressing these challenges. And I think that will come back into focus. But I'm sorry that the timing is very bad in terms of not being able to say anything more specific.
Could I maybe just add about the EU funding? So I mentioned that many low and middle income countries are eligible to get funding from the EU. The full list for the next 7-year programme is yet to be published, but we expect it to be similar to the previous programme. And for consortium type projects, then as long as you meet the minimum eligibility criteria for the main European participants, you can add on low and middle income country participation as well. And there's no set percentage for what that has to be. If you feel it's appropriate in the project, then you can just include people from those countries in the consortiums.
Thank you. There is a anonymous question or a comment and question here, again, in relation to social sciences. In Monday's talk, GovMed talked about communities of practice where interdisciplinary teams work together. So the question is, are university silos between SHAPE, social science, humanities, arts, etc., or STEM more divisive than helpful? Does any of you have any idea about this? Helen?
I think that it's true to say that the traditional silos or administrative academic divisions between departments and particularly faculties are problematic when we're trying to do cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work. Of course, it varies between institutions, but I'm very well aware that many people have difficulties because of very simple bureaucratic differences between, for example, teaching delivery structures across faculties, which make it extremely difficult to align the timetables and availability for researchers, or different buying out and study leave and sabbatical practices, which mean that, for example, someone like me in a medical school will operate on a completely different funding model in terms of my research grants than my colleague who's another anthropologist but works in the arts faculty within the anthropology and archaeology department. So these things are, I think, problematic. It seems to me that a lot of, certainly the research active higher education institutions are conscious of this, and we see a whole range of structures which are put together. I mean, I assume your Bloomsbury Set consortium is precisely one of those that try to get over those hurdles. But I think there is also a longer term question which might partly actually answer the previous, I should have included in my previous answer about cross-disciplinarity, which ultimately has more to do with the sorts of rewards and incentives as well for researchers. So we may have funders and structures which are trying to improve cross-disciplinary working, but ultimately until the REF and other structures which essentially provide people with their academic career progress change adequately to accommodate that and to fully recognize the demands of cross-disciplinary working, it's going to be difficult to get everybody to buy into it completely. I mean, it still remains the fact that it's difficult to publish across disciplines. People have their own favorite journals, which are often siloed in the same way, and the credentials within a discipline-specific department are, awarded different levels of acknowledgement and recognition than people who are choosing to work outside their own department with people elsewhere in the university. So I think those aspects also have to be borne in mind, and universities as a whole, I think, need to start paying more attention to those disincentives which prevent better cross-silo working.
Very insightful, thank you, and very helpful. Actually, there was a comment in the shared space. I think it was also related to our first conversation about interdisciplinarity, and this might be coming from a researcher saying yes to Professor Helen's answer regarding your question. We are also not forward-looking enough. We seem only to react to the previous Sustainable Development Goals or adolescent health report regarding our focus. Just want to read it so everyone hears. So there's another question to all of you. From your respective institutional points of view, what, in your opinion, are the biggest challenges UK innovators and businesses face in tackling global health problems? May I start with Joe, just to give us some views from Innovate UK, although we know you've been working in Innovate UK only recently, moving from MRC. But what do you think the challenges they are facing from your experience?
Yeah, as you said, I'm maybe not the best person to answer this at this precise moment in time, because I've only just recently joined Innovate UK. I can maybe ask Phil to send some thoughts afterwards.
Yeah, perfect. Anything, Ruth? Yeah, from Nesta's perspective.
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess just from the innovator's point of view, and from Nesta, I mean, in terms of all the varied projects that we do, innovators really struggle when it comes to commercialization, scale up, regulations, and there's a whole areas of support that's needed. So in terms of those type of challenges, funding's always going to be one that's going to be a challenge, but there's also understanding the whole ecosystem that they need to understand to develop in the area that they choose to go for. So yeah, that's my point of view.
I would only add, I think that as to what Ruth has said, the issues around regulatory challenges obviously are a clear example of the difficulties for UK innovators and businesses if they're trying to both, make links and create markets globally. But I think there are, for example, UKRI does have offices in India and China, and there are very useful activities which I think Innovate UK is also involved in, relating, for example, to looking at different legislations in relation to regulatory consents for use of technologies, ethics clearance that might be required if you wanted to run, to trial devices, for example, within different contexts. So I think some of our partners across UK government also could be very useful in terms of helping some of these companies and businesses to actually navigate those challenges.
I could maybe just add that companies that are funded by Innovate UK get support from Innovate Edge, which was called the Enterprise Europe Network until recently. So they get an advisor that will meet them and try and provide support in whatever area they need. And there's a bit more information about the support there on the Innovate Edge website.
Thank you, Joe. That's very useful. There's a question for Helen. It's not about a specific funding call, but it's about the future, where the trend is going. So this question is about the fact that we have seen a lot of innovative funding for COVID, and are there likely to be more agile funding from UKRI in the cross-council space in the future, do you think? But we are aware that we only know what is in front of us for the next year. But what is your feeling? Do you think there will be more opportunities in the cross-council space?
I think it has been fantastic. I think the way that the Agile calls have rolled out, and a huge amount of effort went in across the research councils and UKRI and NIHR as well, and to create and manage 3 different funding calls: the primarily UK focused UKRI NHS DHSC call, and then the Agile call, which was UKRI led, and then the third GECCO call, which was Global Effort on COVID-19, which was again a partnership led by MRC and DHSC, NIH through NIHR. Not linked with spending review settlement, just to observe that the Agile and the rolling calls, there was always an agreement with a trajectory to close those calls, or not close them, but wrap those calls into the standard funding mechanisms by around now, by the end of last year, beginning of this year, because the as you can imagine, the effort and to actually be able to turn things around in the case of the Agile call within a space of 2 weeks, and the mechanism for getting peer reviews. I mean, the peer review college has been absolutely amazing in managing to turn around that stuff, and the panelists themselves to be present sort of on a 2-weekly or 3-monthly, or depending on the call, basis throughout the year. But it's not really a sustainable model. So it's not just, oh, well, we don't have funding anymore, so we'll stop. It's a recognition that that sort of rapid response is not something that can be done. It's, it was an acute response to an acute issue. That is not at all to say that COVID does not remain a major priority, and that there won't be funding in the future for that. All the councils are starting to include COVID within there. So, for example, the Applied Global Health Board is one, is the place where future calls, future applications will now go that come in under the MRC trajectory. They will go to that board rather than going to what was GECCO. So there'll be a slightly longer timeline, but there is still, the agreement in place to prioritise in step with the WHO research roadmap, and now to look at COVID recovery in relation to the UNDP COVID recovery roadmap. Those commitments are in place among the UK funders, as elsewhere. And so there will definitely continue to be funding, but I think probably not in that very rapid response mode, unless some massive change, let's hope not, happens in the near future.
Thank you. There's a question for Ruth. As experienced leading foundation in Nesta, especially working with communities and engaging with different communities for innovation, in your view, what do communities and end users expect from innovators and researchers?
So I think from the community point of view, you need to involve, well, it's going back to the interdisciplinary people and everyone that needs to be involved. When you're talking about a diagnostic that's in development, who are the end users? They're going to be clinicians or pharmacists, that are in different markets. So let's say the NHS. So that community needs to be built with all these people inputting into the development of these diagnostic tests. So Nesta does a varied amount of work across lots of different projects. And one of the strengths is building communities. We build relationships with regulators and policymakers, and then feed that those issues and awareness into these communities so they can continue to thrive and work and develop on a project or a solution that can be actually really useful for an end user. As we say, we might have a diagnostic that's in development on the Longitude Prize, and we don't want it to end up just sitting on the shelf in a GP surgery. We want it to be used. So there's lots of different ways of building that community, and it is a focus of a lot of our work and what we do. And to be able to bring the community together, you need to be able to think about different platforms on how to do that, and bringing the different people together in a very creative way. Because people are busy. I think, in the last year, we've had COVID take up a lot of space in terms of people's brain power and expertise in AMR, and that resources have been scarce. So we've had to be really creative to make sure that the community is focused and that we can still get that expertise to the innovators so they can continue to develop diagnostic tests. I think that's
very helpful. That is very helpful. Thank you. There's an interesting question here about the lack of funding for pre-award connection for, I think, research development, and other than just calling or issuing a call. People also often don't know who they should be speaking to. How would the funders suggest we can prepare these networks of different expertise so we are ready when a funding call is announced? Who would like to go first? Helen.
Well, I don't off the top of my head have details in my mind, but there certainly is funding for network development. And I suppose that's slightly comes into the sort of pump priming aspect, which I mentioned earlier. Certainly both Wellcome and ESRC, for example, have run and do run funding schemes, which is primarily around building networks. So, the ESRC, even something like the ESRC seminar series is seen as a means to try to bring together a community of researchers in an area of interest, which might lead to building networks. So I would simply suggest looking at some of the other funding schemes. There are models which obviously we're waiting for Wellcome now to announce their latest funding strategy, but I would be very surprised if they don't also continue to offer that. And there are also a number of exchange schemes and networking activities which are funded by the academies. So it's worth looking at some of those. British Academy, Royal Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, they all have smaller schemes which are designed to try to provide that kind of support, which is some funding support, but not for particular a project or a grant.
Maybe just to add from the EU side, so the Marie Curie scheme in the past has had some funding, exchange funding, where people can build contacts in advance of doing research, or improve the contacts with, improve their links with existing contacts. And also the EU has a separate scheme related to called COST, which is related to the Horizon funding that the UK can take part in as well, which is about networking researchers in different fields.
Thank you. That's very useful. And one of our participants also mentioned earlier in this in the shared space that actually when we notice something, researchers, health activists, medics, about potential gaps, there needs to be a forum for bringing it to each other to build relationship and then funders early. So I think talking to funders, using these small pump priming networking grants to build these connections, and also universities, large organizations creating some ring fencing, maybe some funding for these connections as well, if it is possible, of course, depending on their financial situation, would be very useful. And it's very important, all of these early stages, especially for interdisciplinarity. Helen, like you said, it is small steps, it's very difficult, and it's also an uncomfortable sometimes journey for some researchers, especially from social science and humanities, to see the link, if even though they're not from a disciplinary connection. If someone who's not working in health, it isn't easy to actually see that dotted line, how someone's research can contribute to this bigger agenda. So therefore, we need more support to build these connections as early as possible. And we would like to see funders around that table too, so that we could be part of that conversation. I'd like to now close the question and answers because it's been very useful and we are nearly coming to the end of our session and at the conference. Before I close the session, I'd like to give the final words to my three speakers. If you'd like to tell us once more what is the important message that you'd like us to take away from your talk and from your thinking today that you helped us build. May I start with Helen and Joe and then Ruth in the same order. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to you and to your colleagues for inviting me to speak today. It's been a really interesting panel. And thank you for all the really insightful and knowledgeable questions, challenging questions that some of the participants have been asking. I guess I would, I suppose I would perhaps want to conclude by reiterating the value of talking to each other. I think that's come up through networking, through the issues around clarity of language that I highlighted, and Joe also referred to. You know, it's and these questions also about silos. It's really important to try to get beyond our own initial preconceptions and to try to be open to thinking through how to work with other disciplines and other researchers, with our potential stakeholders, and indeed with potential funders, as far as we possibly can. So I think reaching out is really important. I would also say, I think Ruth mentioned scarce resources, and that's what we are all perforce looking at the moment, sadly, for all the obvious reasons. But I guess I would also just say that in a kind of horrible, for the worst of reasons, the COVID experience in terms of the research community and implications for working on global health and infectious disease and even antimicrobial resistance, I think has been salutary in many ways. It's shown us that we can actually get out of our boxes and work really fast and produce things in a really rapid way that funders can get on board and support diverse and innovative projects. And in particular, linking back to the interdisciplinarity and social science aspect, I think it's revealed in an incredibly salient way for everyone just how fundamental basic issues like health inequality, which people like me, of course, you know, have been banging on about for decades, are. So I think there's a new refreshing, you know, awareness and consensus that actually all of these aspects need to be addressed. it's not just good enough to do one thing. Vaccine may be fantastic, but even then we have to go beyond the lab to work out all of the other dimensions of how we're going to make a success of that. So I hope that lesson will continue to be present, even if in the short term resources remain tight for doing this more imaginative, innovative work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So from me, I guess the key message I had was the one I had in huge green letters on one of my slides, which is that UK scientists and researchers and businesses can take part in the Horizon Europe programme on equivalent terms to EU organisations. So if you're interested in applying for EU funding on health, or maybe you're interested in influencing the future call topics and trying to feed into what calls come out, then please do drop me an email. As a national contact point, I'm a free service here to help people and organisations in the UK interested in the EU health funding. Just to mention that the KTN are organising an event on the 11th of March to speak more about Horizon Europe. It will be a 2-hour introductory session looking mostly at the areas where there's collaborative projects or consortiums. So the booking for that opened. I can arrange for the link to be shared after. We're also planning to do a 2-hour event on the health funding within Horizon Europe. It's not been announced yet, but it will be the 22nd of March from 10 till 12 AM. So you can, if you contact me, I can send you details of how to sign up to be notified of that. In general, most of the EU calls will be coming out in April. There might be some health calls earlier than that in March, particularly related to new COVID variants. And the other exception to the April launch is that the European Research Council has already launched its work programme this week and announced the schedule for some of their calls. So if you're interested in EU funding, please do get in touch with me, and I look forward to speaking to some of you.
I just want to echo some of the points Helen pointed out. I'd recommend building your network with experts as much as possible. Do not underestimate finding mentors, asking for advice and guidance from researchers who have successfully gone through, for example, a funding process you're about to tackle at any stage of your career. You do need to be persistent, as some funding mechanisms take a long time to come through, but people like to help, and all you have to do is ask. We've seen some really great collaborations between Longitude Prize competitors and consultants and mentors, and they've really benefited being connected to successful company founders who have successfully brought a medtech product to market. So yeah, keep your eyes out, and I would recommend building that network. Thanks.
Thank you. It's very, very useful to hear from you this encouragement and this excitement about connections, information sharing, expertise and advice, and especially early career researchers and innovators in the field would definitely benefit from all this advice and following up with the information you mentioned. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. Helen, Joe, Ruth, thank you so much for your time, your valuable time, and sharing all of this with us. And I hope I learned so much from you, and I will definitely follow up with you. And I am hoping that all of the participants also learned from you. I'd like to thank my Bloomsbury Set steering group member colleagues and the project office team, especially Sarah Rhodes, for helping us, and our colleagues with the technical team who have been fantastic in helping us with this journey. And you, the participants, the attendees, thank you for coming today. We'd like to see you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session, which is tomorrow at 11 a.m. We have other sessions tomorrow and Friday. Please book and register and attend and follow up, follow our newsletter and get in touch. And please just stay in touch. And thank you all. Thank you so much. And we'll see you at the next event or our next network, hopefully, when we are discussing a new funding scheme. Thank you.